Jonathan Hale and Margaret Hale seemed like the perfect couple, successful, devoted, and unshakable. But when Jonathan traveled alone to a remote Scottish lodge for a photography assignment, everything changed. What started as a fleeting connection with a young local woman spiraled into betrayal, obsession, and a murder that no one saw coming. In the spring of 2023, Jonathan Hale was offered a solo photography assignment in the Scottish Highlands. For most, this would be a dream job. Endless skies, vast moorlands, and the kind of rugged beauty that seemed untouched by time. For Jonathan, it was more than just work, it was an escape. As a wildlife photographer with over a decade of experience, he had traveled to remote corners of the world capturing rare birds, elusive mammals, and striking landscape. He was respected in his field, published in major magazines, and had even held a few gallery exhibitions. But beneath the surface of his success, things at home were beginning to fracture. Jonathan lived in London with his wife Margaret. They had married young and grown their lives together, but somewhere along the way the closeness had faded. Long absences due to Jonathan's fieldwork had created emotional gaps that neither of them had truly filled. Conversations turned to silence, and affection became routine. Margaret had grown tired of his constant travels. She wanted him home more often. Jonathan, on the other hand, found himself craving the freedom and solitude of the wild. When the travel magazine offered him an extended assignment in Scotland, 4 weeks of solo work with full creative control, he didn't hesitate. He told Margaret it would be good for both of them. Time apart, time to think. Arriving in the Highlands, Jonathan was struck by the quiet. Glencoe, where he would be based, was hauntingly beautiful. The air was crisp, the landscape wide open, and the silence deep. He checked into a rustic lodge nestled between the hills, small, family-run, and far from any major town. It was the kind of place that offered both isolation and intimacy, where every face was familiar by the second day, was friendly but kept their distance, except for one woman who worked the front desk and occasionally served meals. Jonathan's days were filled with hikes through thick heather, patient hours hidden in camouflaged blinds, and slow, careful stalking of his subjects. He captured red deer grazing at dawn, osprey diving for fish, and shadows playing across the hills in the late evening light. Each shot brought a sense of quiet accomplishment, but even as he focused his lens on the wild, something was shifting inside him. He had come to Scotland to get away. From pressure, from routine, from a marriage that felt like a shell. What he didn't realize yet was that he was walking into something far more complicated, something that would change everything. The lodge where Jonathan stayed was simple but charming, with wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace that burned steadily in the evenings, and wide windows that looked out onto the rolling moors. It wasn't luxury, but it had warmth, a kind of quiet hospitality that suited the remote landscape. Most of the guests came and went quickly, staying a night or two before heading deeper into the highlands or back toward the cities. Jonathan, however, was a long-term guest, and that made him stand out. It wasn't long before he noticed one of the lodge's employees more than the other. Her name was Isla Cameron. She was 24, soft-spoken, and seemed to carry the mood of the moors with her wherever she went. Isla wasn't traditionally glamorous, but there was something magnetic about her. She moved with calm confidence, her accent thick with the cadence of the Highlands. She worked the front desk during the day, handled bookings, and sometimes helped with meals or brought firewood in during colder nights. Though she kept a professional distance from most guests, she took a certain interest in Jonathan. The first real connection happened over breakfast. Jonathan had mentioned, offhandedly, a rare bird he'd spotted near the loch, and Isla responded with surprising knowledge. She told him about nesting patterns, migration habits, and where he might get a better view at sunrise. It was unexpected. Over the next few days, their conversations became more frequent, slipping from brief exchanges to longer chats. She'd ask about his photography. He'd ask about the Highlands. There was a slow, steady pull between them. unspoken at first but undeniable. Jonathan found himself lingering in the lodge more often than necessary. He'd return from shoots earlier, hang around the common room with his laptop open but barely used. He started noticing the details of Isla's presence. The way she brushed her hair behind one ear when she laughed. The way she always paused before answering a question. He hadn't felt this drawn to someone in years. What made it more dangerous was how easily it all seemed to happen. There was no clear line crossed, just small moments that stacked on top of each other until there was no way back. He didn't tell her he was married. Perhaps he told himself it didn't matter, that this was temporary, harmless. But as days turned into nights and the air between them grew heavier with possibility, Jonathan knew, deep down, that he was losing control. Something had started that neither of them fully understood, and it was already too late to stop. Back in London, Margaret Hale had grown used to the distance in her marriage. She had watched her husband disappear piece by piece over the years. Not physically. He always came home eventually, but emotionally. The man who once surprised her with wildflowers from roadside stalls and postcards from remote corners of the world had become withdrawn, distracted. Conversations had turned into one-sided updates, and his phone was always face down. She had asked questions, but the answers were always vague, brushed off with tired smiles and promises of being busy. When Jonathan left for Scotland, Margaret didn't protest. She just watched him pack, her silence louder than any argument. But something about this trip felt different. It wasn't the location or the length of time. He'd been away longer before. It was his behavior in the weeks leading up to it. He seemed tense, checking his phone constantly, sometimes smiling to himself before quickly tucking it away. He was more secretive, less engaged at home, and more protective of his devices. Margaret's suspicions, long buried, began to surface again while doing laundry. Margaret noticed Jonathan had left his work tablet on the bed, still unlocked. On impulse, she opened the screen. At first, there was nothing unusual, just emails and a few documents, but then she noticed the iCloud icon. Curiosity took over. When she clicked into the photo backups, what she found made her stomach drop. There were dozens of new photos, all taken within the last week. Most were of landscapes, wide shots of the highlands, close-ups of wildlife, and atmospheric images of the moors. But scattered among them were others. Casual shots of a young woman sitting near a fire, laughing at something off-camera. A blurred photo of two coffee mugs on a small table, one with lipstick on the rim. A mirror selfie with a familiar arm wrapped around someone's waist. Jonathan was never in the frame. But Margaret knew what she was looking at. She didn't cry. She didn't call him. Instead, she quietly began gathering information. She searched flight times to Inverness. She checked the name of the lodge he was staying at, noted the surrounding areas, and even marked potential locations on a printed map. Within 48 hours, Margaret had booked a one-way ticket to Scotland. She told no one. She left no note. She just packed a small bag, turned off her phone, and disappeared into the cold northern air. Whatever she was planning, it wasn't about saving her marriage. It was about finding the truth and facing whatever came next. 3 days after Margaret arrived quietly in Scotland, Jonathan Hale was reported missing. The lodge staff first noticed his absence at breakfast. His table remained empty, his camera bag was gone, and his room appeared undisturbed except for his laptop left on the desk. At first, no one panicked. It wasn't unusual for Jonathan to leave early for a shoot. He often vanished into the hills before sunrise in pursuit of perfect light. But when he didn't return by evening, concern began to grow. Isla was the first to speak up, telling the manager that Jonathan had mentioned heading toward the eastern moorlands the day before. A few locals joined a search, assuming he might have gotten lost or injured. The highlands were beautiful, but they were also treacherous. Endless stretches of bog, unpredictable weather, and very little cell service. As darkness fell and Jonathan still hadn't been found, the lodge called the local police. Over the next several days, the search intensified. Police coordinated with mountain rescue teams, using drones to scan the area and dogs to trace potential scent trails. Helicopters flew over the hills. Jonathan's last known location, confirmed by a time-stamped photo uploaded to his cloud account, placed him near a ridge that overlooked a wide, desolate bog, but there were no fresh footprints, no sign of a fall, no blood. It was as if he had simply vanished into the landscape. Then, on the 6th day, a hiker stumbled upon a body. It was discovered in a remote marshy stretch of moorland nearly 5 miles from the lodge, difficult to reach on foot and well outside the usual tourist trails. The body was face down in a shallow patch of bog, partially concealed by thick grass and water. Nearby, there were no signs of struggle, but something didn't sit right. Jonathan's camera gear was missing, and his coat appeared to have been adjusted after death. There was a dark wound on the side of his head, deep and oddly clean. When the police arrived, they immediately treated the site as suspicious. The injury was not consistent with a fall or animal attack. The location of the body, along with the missing gear and lack of footprints nearby, raised red flags. Even more curious were Jonathan's boots. They were oddly clean, almost untouched by mud, despite the soaked and marshy terrain. Investigators began considering the possibility that the body had been moved. This was no accident. Someone had been with him. Someone knew these hills. And someone wanted him gone. As investigators examined the scene where Jonathan's body was found, more questions surfaced than answers. Forensics quickly ruled out natural causes. The wound on his head was consistent with a blunt object, something heavy with a smooth edge. The positioning of his body also suggested staging. His arms were tucked close to his sides, and his face was turned deliberately downward. No animal would have done that, and no fall would have left him so neatly arranged. The clean state of his boots was the final clue that convinced authorities this was no hiking mishap. Jonathan Hale had been murdered. Detectives began piecing together a timeline. His last confirmed activity was a photo taken at 6:42 a.m., showing the rising sun breaking over a ridge. That gave them a window of just a few hours before he was likely killed. Interviews at the lodge began the next morning. Everyone who had seen or interacted with Jonathan in the days leading up to his disappearance was questioned. Most of the staff had little to say. He was quiet, polite, focused on his work. Only one person admitted to having a closer connection with him, Isla Cameron, who had been noticeably reserved during the early days of the investigation. Finally acknowledged she had been spending time with Jonathan. She said they had formed a friendship, nothing more. He had asked her about local wildlife, and she had offered to show him a few good spots to photograph. When asked if there was any romantic involvement, she denied it flatly. Her story was calm, consistent, and free of emotion, but there was something in her eyes that made the detectives pause. They turned their attention to Margaret next. When asked why she had come to Scotland, she said it was a surprise visit, meant to reconnect. Her demeanor was composed, even when told her husband had been found dead. She provided a detailed alibi, saying she had spent the morning of Jonathan's disappearance at a spa in Fort William, about an hour's drive away. Receipts from the spa, time-stamped around 10 a.m., supported her claim. Security cameras confirmed her presence in the lobby later that morning. Still, something didn't sit right. The timing left a narrow but possible window in which she could have left early, met Jonathan, and then returned. Investigators also found it strange that she hadn't informed anyone of her visit. Not her husband, not the lodge, not even friends back home. Why arrive unannounced? Why stay hidden? As evidence from the scene trickled in, police knew they were looking at a staged accident, but with both women denying involvement and no clear motive established, the case remained murky. What no one knew was that the answer was already in their hands, buried in digital files waiting to be unlocked. As investigators worked through the limited physical evidence, they turned to Jonathan's digital footprint. His laptop, still sitting untouched in his room at the lodge, became a central focus. Technicians combed through files, emails, browser history, and backups, searching for anything that might offer insight into his final days. At first, nothing stood out. He had been uploading photos daily to his cloud account and kept a routine file structure for his work. But buried in his email drafts folder, they discovered something unexpected. There were several unsent messages addressed to Isla Cameron. Each one was different in tone, revealing a man caught between desire and guilt. In the earlier drafts, he wrote with affection, saying he had never felt so free in years, that the time they had shared had opened something in him he thought was gone. He talked about leaving London, starting fresh and coming back to the Highlands, not for work, but for her. But the tone shifted abruptly in the later drafts. One message, dated the night before his disappearance, read like a confession. He apologized for misleading her, admitted he was still married, and said he was ending things for good. It was clear he had decided to return to his wife. "This isn't right," he wrote. "I have to fix what I broke." The message was never sent. Then came the final draft. Different from the rest. It was only a few lines, written with a sense of unease. He mentioned seeing someone near the edge of the moors during one of his early shoots. At first he thought it was a fellow hiker, or maybe a shepherd, but they hadn't approached or acknowledged him. In the email, he said the figure reappeared 2 more times in the same area. "They're following me," he wrote. "I don't know who it is, but something feels wrong." This final email was saved at 11:18 p.m. the night before Jonathan went missing. He hadn't mentioned the figure to anyone at the lodge, nor was there any record of him discussing it with Margaret. That draft changed the tone of the investigation. Now detectives had reason to believe Jonathan was afraid, and that someone had been watching him. The troubling part was that the email had never been sent. No one would have known about it unless they accessed the device directly. That fact alone narrowed the suspect pool. Someone had a reason to silence him before the truth came out, and whoever it was had likely read the email before the police ever saw it. The digital trail was starting to unravel the lies. As the investigation deepened, detectives revisited the lodge's limited security system. There was only one camera, an old motion-activated model, mounted above the main entrance, pointed toward the front parking area. The footage wasn't high quality, and it didn't capture audio, but it offered a basic view of who came and went. Investigators reviewed days of footage, hoping for a glimpse of Jonathan on the morning he disappeared. Instead, they found something far more significant. At 5:17 a.m. Eastern, just over an hour before Jonathan's final photo was timestamped, the camera caught someone slipping out the back of the lodge. The angle didn't show the exit directly, but a shadow moved along the side of the building, just barely crossing into the edge of the frame. It wasn't Jonathan. The person was wearing a dark coat with a fur-trimmed hood and moving quickly. Investigators zoomed in and enhanced the frame as much as possible. Though the figure's face was obscured, the body language was cautious, someone who didn't want to be seen. That afternoon, detectives compared the footage against what the lodge guests had reported. Only one person had not been seen that morning until well after breakfast: Margaret Hale. According to her earlier statement, she had spent the entire morning at a spa in Fort William, but when police checked the spa's full CCTV footage, they found that she didn't arrive until just before 10:30 a.m., much later than she claimed. Even more telling was her phone data. The night before Jonathan's disappearance, her phone had been turned off at 9:42 p.m. and remained off until 11:06 a.m., and the next day, investigators obtained cell tower logs and discovered her phone had last pinged a rural tower near Glenetiv, roughly 2 miles from the bog where Jonathan's body was found. It contradicted her alibi entirely. They returned to the lodge and searched Margaret's room. Tucked in the bottom of her suitcase, beneath a stack of folded clothes, they found a black coat with a fur-trimmed hood, identical to the one seen in the security footage. There were small smudges of mud on the cuffs and hem, even though she claimed never to have left paved paths. Confronted with the inconsistencies, Margaret remained calm, insisting she had taken a scenic walk and must have lost track of time, but investigators weren't convinced. The spa alibi had crumbled. The footage, the coat, and the phone data painted a far different story, one of deception and movement through the early morning hours, well before Jonathan had vanished. The web was tightening around her. But they still needed more, something definitive, something that would leave no doubt. The breakthrough came when investigators turned their attention to Jonathan's missing camera. His top-of-the-line DSLR had vanished from the scene, along with the long telephoto lens he used for wildlife photography. Detectives believed whoever killed him had taken it to prevent something from being discovered. Perhaps a photo, perhaps metadata. They conducted multiple sweeps of the area where his body was found, hoping to locate any piece of discarded equipment. On the third search, nearly a week after the body was discovered, a volunteer with a metal detector made a crucial find. At the base of a gully not far from the bog, buried under wet leaves and brush, lay Jonathan's camera. It was waterlogged and badly damaged, likely tossed there to rot, but miraculously the memory card was still intact. Investigators rushed it to a lab for recovery. Every image was pulled, catalogued, and reviewed, in order. Most were what they expected. Photos of red deer sweeping moorland, birds mid-flight, beautiful, crisp, and professionally composed. But as they neared the final images taken before his death, something changed. One image stood out. It was blurry, unfocused, likely taken by accident while the camera was in motion. The horizon was tilted, part of the lens was obscured, and nothing seemed clear at first glance. But in the lower corner of the frame, the investigators spotted something. A human arm, partially covered by a coat sleeve, and on the wrist, a bracelet. Not a common one. It was silver, with 3 distinct charms, a thistle, a bird, and a small Celtic knot. A closer look confirmed what some officers had already suspected. That bracelet had been seen before. On Margaret Hale, in earlier interviews, she had worn it often. Photos taken by tourists at the lodge, uploaded to social media, showed her wearing it in the dining room near the fireplace, and once while walking outside. The design was unique, unmistakable. That accidental photograph placed her at the scene, just moments before Jonathan's death. When confronted with the image, Margaret's expression faltered for the first time. The cool, composed mask she had worn began to slip. She asked for a lawyer, and the interview was immediately suspended. But investigators knew they had what they needed. The bracelet in the photo wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a timeline marker. It was proof that Margaret had been with Jonathan in those final moments, right before he was struck and left in the bog. The camera she'd tried to erase had, in the end, spoken louder than words. It had captured her in the act, not of murder itself, but of presence. And in a case built on deception, that was enough to turn suspicion into certainty. Media showed her wearing it in the dining room near the fireplace, and once while walking outside. The design was unique, unmistakable. That accidental photograph placed her at the scene, just moments before Jonathan's death. When confronted with the image, Margaret's expression faltered for the first time. The cool, composed mask she had worn began to slip. She asked for a lawyer, and the interview was immediately suspended. But investigators knew they had what they needed. The bracelet in the photo wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a timeline marker. It was proof that Margaret had been with Jonathan in those final moments, right before he was struck and left in the bog. The camera she'd tried to erase had, in the end, spoken louder than words. It had captured her in the act, not of murder itself, but of presence. And in a case built on deception, that was enough to turn suspicion into certainty. With the newfound evidence placing Margaret at the scene of Jonathan's death, the investigation took a sharp turn. Police obtained a warrant to search her belongings thoroughly, focusing on any clues that might explain what happened during those final hours. Among her personal effects, they found a detailed journal, pages filled with careful handwriting chronicling days leading up to and following her arrival in Scotland. The journal revealed a side of Margaret no one had suspected. Behind her calm exterior, she had been consumed by jealousy and suspicion. Entries detailed her growing unease about Jonathan's behavior, his distance, and what she described as the woman at the lodge. Margaret wrote of sleepless nights spent imagining the worst, of anger that simmered beneath a polite facade. She admitted to confronting him over the phone several times, but he had always brushed her off. Most chilling were the final entries, written in the days before Jonathan's disappearance. Margaret described a plan to find the truth herself. She spoke of traveling to the Highlands without warning, of watching Jonathan from a distance, and of preparing herself for a confrontation. One passage hinted at regret, but it was overshadowed by a determination to end what she saw as betrayal. Forensics also uncovered a new detail. Traces of soil found on Margaret's shoes matched the unique peat bog near the moors where Jonathan's body was found. It was irrefutable evidence that she had been in the exact area police suspected was the crime scene. This was a critical breakthrough. It meant Margaret's earlier claim of simply taking a walk was a lie. When questioned again under the weight of mounting evidence, Margaret finally admitted to meeting Jonathan on the moors. She claimed the encounter was intended to be a calm discussion, an attempt to reconcile or at least understand what had happened between them. According to her, the argument escalated unexpectedly. Words were exchanged, tempers flared, and in a moment of fury, she pushed him. She insisted it was an accident, that she hadn't meant to cause serious harm. But the blunt force injury on Jonathan's head told a harsher story. The police believed that what Margaret described as a push was actually a violent blow with a heavy object she had grabbed nearby, possibly a rock or a piece of fallen wood. Afterward, panicked and realizing the gravity of what she'd done, Margaret tried to cover her tracks. She moved Jonathan's body to the bog and hid his camera, hoping to erase evidence. The final piece of the puzzle was the digital trail on her phone, which showed that she had turned off the device during and after the incident, then turned it back on hours later to fabricate an alibi. It was a calculated attempt to mislead investigators. Margaret Hale's carefully constructed world had unraveled, revealing a cold-blooded killer who had hidden in plain sight behind the guise of a wronged wife, determined to reclaim her life. In the weeks that followed Margaret Hale's confession, the small Highland community grappled with the shocking truth. The serene landscape, so often seen as a place of peace and solitude, had been the backdrop for a brutal crime born from betrayal and desperation. News spread quickly, drawing attention from national media and true crime enthusiasts alike, fascinated by the tangled web of passion and violence. The trial that ensued was intense but brief. Prosecutors presented a compelling case using the digital evidence, forensic findings, and Margaret's own journal entries as key pieces. The defense attempted to argue that the killing was accidental, a tragic loss fueled by emotional distress rather than premeditation, yet the jury was swayed by the weight of evidence, especially the calculated steps Margaret took to conceal the crime, the disposal of the camera, the fabricated alibi, and the phone's deliberate shutdown. Margaret was found guilty of manslaughter, a verdict that reflected both the violence of the act and the complicated emotions behind it. She received a prison sentence that sent ripples through her family and Jonathan's colleagues, many of whom struggled to reconcile the image of the loving wife with the woman who had taken a life. But the story didn't end there. As the dust settled, a small detail, overlooked for weeks, finally came to light. A local resident, while exploring the moors, found a worn leather notebook half buried near the edge of the bog. It contained sketches and notes, Devon's personal observations during his assignment. Among the pages was an entry that raised new questions. He felt, watching him, a shadow that seemed to follow his movements even when no one was around. He speculated that someone at the lodge had been spying on him, recording his routines. Most chilling was a drawing of a face, rough, vague, but unmistakably different from both Margaret and Isla. Detectives reopened parts of the case quietly, curious if there might be another figure involved. Someone who had perhaps manipulated events from the sideline. Yet no new suspects emerged, and the case officially remained closed to everyone except for those who followed the story. The lingering mystery added a final layer of unease. Jonathan's death was no simple crime of passion, but a tangled tragedy, with shadows still lurking beneath the surface. His affair, the betrayal, and the desperate act of violence had left scars on the landscape and in the lives of everyone involved. In the end, it was a small, easily missed detail, the bracelet caught in a blurry photo, that cracked the case open, a reminder that in true crime, even the smallest clue can expose the darkest secrets hidden in plain sight.